Hey fifth graders, for this week's at-home math activity, we're going to preview what our next unit is going to be about. So our next unit is going to be focusing on something called decimals, which maybe many of you know already what a decimal is or what it looks like, but we're going to talk about place value and how decimals and fractions are similar, and how our knowledge of fractions will help us understand decimals. So all I'd like you to do is to watch this video. You don't need to take notes or do any work problems on a piece of paper. I just want you to watch and listen. This is what we're going to learn about when you come back face-to-face next week, but I think it would be helpful to at least preview it so you feel a little bit more confident as we learn it when you come back. So to start off, a decimal is a number based on the number 10 that contains a decimal point. Now, you may not know what that means based on the number 10, but you probably have seen what a decimal point is before. So let's take a look here at the example down here. Here is the number 45 and 6/10, or some people say 45.6, written as a decimal number. So let's look over here at this number. If we ignore the 6 over here and we just focus on the whole number, 45, we've learned in math class before that 4 represents the number 40, or 4 tens, and 5 represents the place value 1s, which means there are 5 ones. 40 tens plus 5 ones gets us the number 45. We know that. But sometimes numbers are not equivalent or not whole numbers. And in that case, we use decimal points to represent numbers that represent a fractional part of the whole number. So the 4 represents the tens, the 5 represents the ones, and when we see that decimal point, every number to the right of the decimal point represents a fractional part. So the 6 here after the decimal, instead of being the ones place, like on the left for whole numbers, because it's after the decimal, the 6 actually represents 6/10. The decimal point goes in between the ones and the tens place, always. The left side's always going to be the ones place, the right side is always going to be the tens place. 45 and 6/10 has 4 tens, 5 ones, and 6/10. And this is what it would look like as a picture. So here are my 41s. Here are my 40 tens. Here are my 5 ones. And then it represents 6/10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there are 6 tiny fractional parts and 6/10, which combined together equals 45 and 6/10. Now let's discover how all of this works. Let's talk a little bit about place value. When we write numbers, the position or place of each digit is very important. So let's just take a whole number, for example, the number 327. If I told you to label the place values, you would say that the 7 is in the ones position, meaning 7 ones. The 2 is in the tens position, meaning 2 tens, which is 20, because 2 times 10 is 20. And the 3 in the hundreds place or position, meaning 3 hundreds, 3 times 100. So as we move to the left, you notice each position gets 10 times bigger. Starts with 1, times 10 is 10, times 10 is 100, and if we kept going larger, we would go to thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, and we would continue going larger. So to the left is always larger. But when we're talking about a decimal point, when we involve a decimal point, when we move to the right of the decimal point, it's actually getting 10 times smaller. So instead of multiplying by the whole number 10, we're multiplying by the fraction 1/10. We go from hundreds to tens to ones, we see our decimal point, and that begins the tenths place. But what if we continue past ones? What is 10 times smaller than 1? Like I said before, it equals 1/10. All right, let's stop there for a second, okay? And what I want you to do before we move on is I want you to pause this screen and really truly understand the difference between whole numbers and fractions. Whole numbers represent a whole piece. Fraction represents just a part of that whole piece. So we need to understand that the whole number gets larger. Anything after the decimal point gets smaller. Okay? If you understand that, if that makes sense to you, let's keep going in the video. If not, please rewatch the first 5 minutes of this video. I want to make sure you understand this because it's going to help us as you come back to school next week and we do some practice together. And if you still don't have questions, just email Mrs. Thomas and I will try to help you as much as I can. So let's talk about that handy dandy decimal point here. Whenever we see the decimal point, we know that to the left is the whole number, to the right is the tens place, and then it gets smaller as we go each place value. We would say this number as 327, and when we see that decimal point, it represents the word and for tenths. Many people say 327.4, but I want you to get in the habit of saying and, because that decimal point will help us understand when we say and, we're adding on an additional fractional part. And here are the fractions. So get in the habit of trying to say this using the word and try to avoid saying point, like 1.5 or 2.7. And that is a decimal number. We can continue with smaller and smaller values from tenths to hundredths and so on, like in this example. And in this video, you can see this is the tens place, the ones place, this is the decimal point, and anything after that is our fractional part. So the 5 represents 1/10, and as we get smaller or multiply by 1/10, just like we would over here, multiplying by 10, we get smaller. We go to the hundredths place, to the thousandths place, and as we continue moving on place value, it gets smaller and smaller. Okay? So I want you to practice, or I'm going to show you a little bit here. If I multiply by 10, notice my whole number gets larger. But if I divide by 10, notice how my decimal gets smaller. And smaller and smaller the more I divide by 10. So when I multiply by 10, it gets larger. When I divide by 10, it gets smaller. So that's where we're going to stop for right now. I just wanted to introduce decimals to you for next week. I'm going to give you a practice activity when you come back as well. But what I'd like you to do next is to set your timer for 45 minutes, and I'd like you to go and work on your math pathways. Many of you are only on scale 4 or 5, so I would really like you to spend lots of time watching the videos, practicing, and taking those quizzes, and trying to get at least a 4 and a 5 on the quiz for each pathway, for each section. So spend some time doing that right now, and hopefully you'll feel ready to go when we talk about decimals when you return next week.